The sheriff never looked at me first. He looked at the gate. That was the first thing I noticed. A heavy steel gate blocked the only road into my ranch. Fresh concrete still surrounded the steel posts. A bright sign read, "Private HOA access. Authorized entry only." Behind it, an excavator sat quietly, its diesel engine idling in the cool Texas morning. Two deputies stood beside their cruisers without saying a word. About 20 homeowners gathered behind the barricade, coffee cups in hand, phones already pointed toward the entrance. They weren't there because they were curious. They were there because they expected to watch me lose. Rebecca Holloway stood at the front of the crowd wearing a cream-colored blazer and holding a leather portfolio against her side. She looked completely at ease, like someone who had already rehearsed the ending. The moment I stepped out of my pickup, she smiled. "Sheriff," she called, pointing straight at me. "That's him. He's been trespassing on HOA property." I quietly closed my truck door. There wasn't much point in arguing. Property lines don't move just because somebody talks louder. The sheriff gave me a quick glance before looking back at the gravel beneath his boots. Not at the gate. Not at Rebecca. At the road itself. That caught my attention. If someone reports an active trespass, law enforcement usually starts with the person being accused. Instead, one deputy walked toward an old survey marker half buried beside the fence line. He knelt, brushed away years of dust with his glove, and studied it for several seconds. Rebecca never even looked in his direction. "We've sent certified notices," she continued confidently. "We've held hearings. We've given him every opportunity to comply." A few homeowners nodded. Someone chuckled. Another raised a phone a little higher to capture what they expected would happen next. The contractor waiting beside the excavator shifted his weight and adjusted his hard hat. He glanced at the sheriff, then at the machine behind him, as if waiting for someone to tell him to start digging. No one did. The only sound came from boots crunching across limestone as the deputy stood and looked back toward the sheriff. They exchanged a quick glance. Nothing more. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my attorney, Sarah Mitchell. "Don't argue. Don't explain. Let them tell their story first." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Rebecca caught the movement and smiled even wider. "Calling your lawyer won't help," she said. "The county already knows whose road this is." I didn't answer. Funny thing was, the sheriff still hadn't asked me a single question. Not my name. Not for my driver's license. Not why I was there. Nothing. He accepted Rebecca's folder, flipped through a few pages, then stopped at the parcel number near the bottom. He looked from the paperwork to the old survey marker, then back again. The deputy gave the slightest nod. The sheriff quietly closed the folder. At almost the exact same moment, the excavator's engine went silent. Nobody had told the operator to shut it off. He'd made that decision all by himself. And standing there beside my pickup, I had the feeling he wasn't the first person who'd started wondering if this road belonged to someone other than the HOA. Rebecca took the sheriff's silence as a good sign. I could almost see it happen. Her shoulders relaxed. The smile on her face got a little bigger. Then she turned toward the homeowners behind her like someone about to announce a victory. "I told you we'd get this resolved," she said. "Once the report's finished, the road officially comes back under HOA control." A few people nodded. One man folded his arms with a satisfied grin. Another stopped recording and slipped his phone into his pocket, convinced the interesting part was over. From where they stood, I understood why. The HOA had called the sheriff's office. I was the one accused of trespassing. Rebecca had arrived carrying a folder full of documents. On the surface, the story looked pretty straightforward. The sheriff, however, didn't seem interested in the surface. He slowly looked down the gravel road until it disappeared between the live oaks leading toward my ranch house. Then he turned to one of the deputies. "Take another look at the entrance." "Yes, sir." The deputy walked past the gate and stopped beside the old cattle guard that had been there longer than I had. He crouched down and brushed dirt away from a weathered steel plate welded into the frame. He rubbed the numbers with his thumb, copied something into his notebook, then stood without saying a word. Rebecca kept talking. "We've spent months trying to handle this peacefully. Mr. Carter ignored every certified notice we sent." I let her keep talking. Sarah's text echoed in my head. "Let them tell their story first." Across the road, the contractor glanced toward his foreman. Neither man climbed back into the excavator. They simply waited. After enough years in construction, you learn not to start digging until you're sure you're standing in the right place. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. Has he asked you to leave yet? I looked up from the screen. She was right. The sheriff still hadn't spoken to me. Not once. No request for identification. No warning about trespassing. No order to step away from the road. Nothing. That wasn't how these calls usually went. If law enforcement believes you're somewhere you don't belong, you're normally the first person they question. Instead, the sheriff opened Rebecca's folder again. He flipped through a few pages before looking up. Mrs. Holloway, he said calmly, when was this roadway last surveyed? Rebecca answered immediately. Our attorney handled all of that. Do you know when? She hesitated. Not the exact date. Who performed the survey? Another pause. I'd have to check. All right. He closed the folder. That was it. No lecture. No argument. Just another quiet note that disappeared into his memory. The silence that followed felt different. Behind Rebecca, I noticed an older couple exchange a quick look. A woman lowered her coffee cup without taking another sip. Even the contractor shifted his attention away from the excavator and back toward the deputies. Funny thing was, nobody seemed interested in me anymore. Every question pointed toward the road. Every photograph showed the entrance. Every note went into a deputy's notebook without my name ever coming up. Rebecca believed they were building a case against the ranch owner. Standing there beside my pickup, I had a feeling they were trying to answer a completely different question. The first real crack was so small that almost nobody noticed it. Rebecca certainly didn't. She was too busy smiling at the homeowners behind her. Everything's moving exactly the way our attorney said it would, she announced. Once the sheriff finishes up, we'll finally put this behind us. A few people nodded. Someone even thanked her for protecting the neighborhood. I kept watching the deputies instead. The one near the cattle guard walked back toward the old survey marker carrying a tape measure. He stretched it from the marker to a weathered cedar fence post that had probably been standing there longer than either of us had been alive. He checked the measurement once. Then he checked it again. After writing something in his notebook, he looked toward the sheriff. Sheriff? He called quietly. The sheriff walked over without rushing. The deputy pointed at the notebook, then at the survey marker. The sheriff studied both for several seconds. He didn't say much. He simply looked down the gravel road again before handing the notebook back. Rebecca stepped closer. Is there a problem? Just verifying a few things, the sheriff replied. About the road? About the property. She smiled politely. Our attorney already verified all of that. The sheriff nodded once. I'm sure they reviewed what they had. He glanced at the old marker again. I'm reviewing what's here. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Even Rebecca's smile seemed a little less certain than before. Behind her, I noticed two homeowners looking toward the survey marker instead of at me. The contractor walked over to his foreman and quietly said, "Let's hold off." Neither man climbed back into the excavator. The machine stayed silent. My phone buzzed again. Sarah, still no questions? I typed back 2 words. Not one. Her reply came almost immediately. Good. Wait. The sheriff looked toward the second deputy. Check the west fence line. Yes, sir. The deputy headed across the grass, following the fence until he disappeared behind a stand of cedar trees. Rebecca watched him leave before turning back to the sheriff. Why are you looking for survey markers? She asked. Because they tend to outlast opinions. That was all he said. One of the homeowners let out a quiet laugh, but it faded almost as quickly as it started. Nobody else smiled. The older gentleman standing near the back took off his sunglasses and stared at the weathered piece of iron sticking out of the ground. I've driven past that thing for years, he said quietly to his wife. Never paid any attention to it. She nodded. Me neither. Funny how something everyone ignores for decades can suddenly become the most important thing in the county. A few moments later, the deputy reappeared from behind the cedar trees. He didn't wave anyone over. He simply looked at the sheriff and gave one slow nod. The sheriff looked toward the entrance, then back at Rebecca's folder, then at the old survey marker one more time. He closed the folder without another word. Standing there beside my pickup, I couldn't tell what he'd found. But I was beginning to think it wasn't what Rebecca had expected him to find at all. Looking back, I can tell you exactly when this stopped being a simple disagreement between a ranch owner and an HOA. It wasn't when the certified letters started showing up in my mailbox. It wasn't when the fines appeared. And it wasn't even when Rebecca called the sheriff's office. It happened the moment those deputies ignored me and started following the road instead. That should have been everyone's first clue. The sheriff walked slowly past the old survey marker without saying a word. One deputy stayed near the entrance while the other followed the fence line, stopping every so often to study the ground before making another note in his notebook. Rebecca watched them for a moment before finally speaking up. "Sheriff," she said, "I'm not sure why we're spending so much time looking at old survey markers. Our attorney already completed the title review." The sheriff glanced at her briefly. Maybe they did. Then he looked back toward the gravel road. "I'd still like to see the whole picture." Rebecca smiled, but it didn't look quite as confident as before. "The whole picture is in the paperwork." "Sometimes," the sheriff replied. "Sometimes it's on the ground." Then he kept walking. Nobody followed him. Nobody stopped him. The homeowners who had been chatting all morning slowly fell quiet. Even the contractor wandered a few steps closer, his hard hat tucked under one arm. It was strange to watch. 20 minutes earlier, everyone had been looking at me. Now every set of eyes followed the deputies instead. Funny thing was, the road hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was where people were looking. My grandfather used to tell me that land has a longer memory than people do. I never really understood what he meant until years later. Fences get replaced. Gates wear out. Roads get widened. Neighbors move away. But the land remembers where everything started. That's why he never trusted opinions nearly as much as he trusted old records and survey markers. They didn't care who was popular. They didn't care who won elections. They were there long before any of us arrived, and they'd probably still be there after we were gone. Rebecca knew everything about Redstone Ridge. She knew every board member, every committee meeting, every HOA rule. She probably knew every lot number in the subdivision. But she'd never known this ranch before those houses existed. She'd never watched my grandfather spread crushed limestone one truckload at a time. She'd never helped my father pull a broken fence back into place after a storm. To her, this road looked like an entrance to a neighborhood. To my family, it was simply the road home. The deputy suddenly stopped near an old cedar tree and crouched beside something hidden beneath the grass. He brushed away a layer of dirt with his glove and stayed there for several seconds. Then he looked back at the sheriff. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply gave one slow nod. The sheriff walked over, bent down beside him, and studied whatever they had found. Neither man spoke. The breeze drifted through the live oaks. Somewhere across the pasture, a cow let out a low call. Behind me, I heard the contractor quietly set his hard hat on the hood of his truck. Nobody seemed interested in starting construction anymore. Whatever those deputies were looking at, it wasn't inside Rebecca's folder. And judging by the look on the sheriff's face, it was something important enough to change the rest of the morning. While the deputies kept following the old boundary markers, my mind drifted back to a very different morning. No patrol cars. No steel gate. No HOA. Just my grandfather, an aging dump truck, and a stretch of rocky pasture that barely deserved to be called a road. Thomas Carter bought this ranch in 1952 after coming home from the Korean War. He didn't buy it because it was the best land in the county. He bought it because it was the only land he could afford. Most people saw limestone hills, cedar brush, and more work than opportunity. He saw a place where, if he worked hard enough, nobody else would ever tell his family how to live. Back then, the county road stopped almost half a mile from where our house sits today. If you wanted to reach the north pasture, you either bounced through mud or waited for the ground to dry. My grandfather wasn't very good at waiting. So every Saturday, after finishing a full week of work, he loaded crushed limestone into an old dump truck that seemed to break down every other trip. My father used to laugh whenever he told that story. Some weekends, he'd say, we hauled more wrenches than gravel. Little by little, load by load, the road began to take shape. It wasn't finished in a month, or even a season. It took nearly 2 summers before the truck finally rolled all the way to the creek without sinking into the dirt. There wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony when they finished. My grandfather simply drove across it the next morning because the cattle still needed feeding. That's how he celebrated most accomplishments. He went back to work. By the time I came along, that gravel road had become part of everyday life. I learned to drive an old pickup on it before I was tall enough to see comfortably over the steering wheel. I learned how to back a cattle trailer down it without jackknifing. I learned that after a hard rain, the limestone drained better than any dirt road in the county. Nearly every lesson my father ever taught me started somewhere along that stretch of gravel. Every time we passed the old survey marker near the entrance, he'd ease off the gas just enough to point toward it. Never forget where that sits, he'd say. People replace fences. Gates come and go. But that marker remembers where everything belongs. At the time, I thought he was talking about surveying. Looking back, he was talking about responsibility. He knew the ranch would someday belong to me. And with it would come the job of protecting more than land. Protecting the truth about it. Standing beside the sheriff's cruiser all those years later, watching two deputies brush dirt away from that same weathered survey marker, I finally understood why my father never let me ignore it. My grandfather hadn't spent 2 summers building that road because he thought someone might challenge it one day. He built it because his family needed it. My father protected it because it carried our future. And whether Rebecca Holloway realized it or not, she had just picked a fight with something that meant a whole lot more than a shortcut through a subdivision. Most people looked at that road and saw nothing special. Just a strip of gravel connecting the county road to a neighborhood. Rebecca saw the same thing. To her, it was a better entrance for the subdivision. Easier access for contractors. A shorter route for residents. Something the HOA should manage. She wasn't trying to erase my family's history. The truth was, she probably never knew it existed. That's the strange part about old places. If you weren't there when the story began, it's easy to believe it started with you. My family saw something completely different every time we drove through that entrance. My mother used to stand on the front porch every evening around sunset. She'd hear my father's pickup before she ever saw it. The sound of tires rolling across crushed limestone carried through the pasture in a way no other truck ever did. She'd smile, wipe her hands on her apron, and say, "He's almost home." She was never wrong. Years later, after Emily and I were married, she started doing exactly the same thing. One evening she laughed and said, "I guess your mom was right. Every pickup really does sound different." Some of my favorite memories were the quiet ones. Drinking black coffee from an old thermos while sitting on the tailgate before sunrise. Watching fog drift across the pasture. Listening to meadowlarks wake up in the live oaks while cattle wandered toward the creek. Emily loved mornings like that. Every spring she'd scatter bluebonnet seeds along both sides of the ranch road because she thought every home deserved a proper welcome. The first year they bloomed, she stood beside the mailbox smiling like she'd planted an entire field. "Now it finally feels complete," she said. Even after she was gone, the flowers kept coming back every April. I never planted another seed. I never had to. They already knew where they belonged. Funny thing was, none of those memories showed up on a survey. They weren't written into a deed. You couldn't find them in county records. But they mattered every bit as much as the paperwork locked inside my fireproof cabinet. My grandfather's sweat was buried beneath the limestone. My father's lessons waited beside that old survey marker. Emily's bluebonnets still framed the entrance every spring. Rebecca couldn't see any of that. She measured the road in traffic flow and property values. My family measured it in years. Neither of us was looking at the same piece of land anymore. Standing beside the sheriff's cruiser, I noticed one of the deputies stop halfway down the entrance. He wasn't writing anything. He wasn't measuring anything. He simply stood there looking toward the ranch house for a few quiet seconds before turning back to the old survey marker. Then he said something so softly I couldn't hear it. The sheriff looked down the road, then slowly nodded. That was it. No speeches. No conclusions. Just a quiet moment between two men who were beginning to understand that this wasn't just another property dispute. It was a family story that happened to be written on a piece of land. And somewhere along the way, the HOA had mistaken that story for an empty road. Looking back, the first warning didn't come from Rebecca Holloway. It didn't come from a lawyer's letter or an HOA meeting. It came from a little orange survey flag planted beside my mailbox. At the time, I barely gave it a second thought. Around ranch country, utility crews leave flags everywhere. Most of us stopped noticing them after a while. I pulled it out on my way to town and forgot about it before lunch. 2 days later, another one showed up. This one caught my attention. It wasn't near the county road or a utility easement. It was several feet inside my fence line, right beside the ranch road. I pulled that one out too. By the end of the week, 4 more appeared. They weren't scattered around randomly. They followed the road almost perfectly, like someone was tracing it one marker at a time. Funny thing was, none of them had utility markings. No company logo. No permit number. Nothing. Just bright orange flags where they didn't belong. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the county courthouse. Linda Foster looked up from behind the recorder's counter and smiled. Morning, Ben. Everything okay? That's what I'm here to find out, I said. Has anyone requested a survey or filed anything against Carter Ranch? She searched the county database for nearly 20 minutes. Every few minutes, she'd open another file, study it for a moment, then quietly move on. Finally, she leaned back and shook her head. Nothing. Nothing at all. No survey request. No easement application. No boundary adjustment. No new filings affecting your property. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, it started a new one inside my head. If the county hadn't authorized anything, who kept planting those flags? A few evenings later, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the edge of my entrance. They weren't from ranch trucks. The tread was wider, newer, expensive SUVs, if I had to guess. Whoever they belonged to had pulled over, looked around, then driven away without ever coming through the gate. It didn't seem important at the time. Looking back, it should have. A couple of days later, I ran into my neighbor, Frank Lawson, at the feed store. While we loaded sacks of cattle cubes into our pickups, he casually asked, "You met the new HOA president yet?" I shook my head. "Rebecca Holloway," he said. "Word is she's got big plans for the subdivision. Wants to improve traffic before they start building the next phase." I wished him a good day and headed home. HOA business had never crossed onto ranch land before. I didn't expect this time to be any different. That turned out to be another mistake. A week later, I found bright construction ribbon tied around two cedar fence posts near the cattle guard. Not survey ribbon, construction ribbon. Someone wasn't measuring anymore. Someone was getting ready to build. I cut it down, tossed it into the bed of my pickup, and drove on. Then one evening, just before sunset, I noticed two unfamiliar pickups parked along the county road overlooking my entrance. The men inside never got out. They just sat there watching the ranch for nearly 20 minutes before driving away. Standing beside the sheriff months later, watching deputies study those same old survey markers, I finally understood what I'd been looking at all along. They weren't watching traffic. They were studying a road they had already convinced themselves belonged to someone else. The next morning, I stopped trying to figure it out from my driveway and went straight to the one place that couldn't afford to guess, the county courthouse. My grandfather used to say there are two ways to settle a property dispute. One starts with opinions. The other starts with records. He never had much patience for the first one. Just after 8, I walked into the county recorder's office carrying the original deed my father had kept in a fireproof cabinet for decades. The courthouse looked exactly the way I remembered it. Same limestone walls. Same worn wooden floors. Same old clock quietly ticking above the hallway. Linda Foster looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Morning, Ben. What can I do for you?" "I'm hoping the answer is nothing," I said. "Can you check everything filed against Carter Ranch?" She nodded and turned to her computer. For the next 20 minutes, she searched deed records, easements, survey filings, boundary adjustments, and parcel history. Every few minutes, she'd open another record, study it, then quietly move to the next one. Finally, she leaned back. "Nothing's changed. Nothing. No transfer of title. No amended deed. No recorded easement. No boundary adjustment. As far as the county is concerned, Carter Ranch is exactly what it was before." That answered one question. It created another. If the county hadn't changed anything, why was the HOA acting like it had? "Can I see the original survey?" I asked. Linda disappeared into the archives and came back carrying a long cardboard tube with faded county markings on the side. "Haven't opened this one in a long time," she said. We carefully unrolled the survey across a large table. The paper was yellow with age, but every line remained clear. Fence corners, creek crossings, survey monuments. Then my eyes settled on the gravel road. It was right where it had always been. Beside it, written in neat lettering, were 4 simple words. Private agricultural access, Carter Ranch. I ordered certified copies before leaving the courthouse. An hour later, I was sitting across from Sarah Mitchell as she spread the deed, the original survey, and the current county parcel map across her conference table. She compared bearings, distances, legal descriptions. She barely spoke for almost half an hour. Finally, she leaned back. "Your paperwork's solid. So why is Rebecca so sure?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the subdivision records we'd requested the day before. She slowly flipped through the recorded plats until one page made her stop. She studied it a little longer than the others. Then she picked up a ruler and checked something twice. Interesting, she said quietly. What is? She looked at me for a moment before closing the folder. I don't know yet. You usually know. She smiled. Usually. Then she slid the subdivision records back into her briefcase. Before we reach any conclusions, I want one more file. From where? County planning. What are you looking for? She stood up and grabbed her keys. Not ownership. Then what? She held the office door open. I'm trying to find out why someone became so certain they owned something the county says they never did. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized the investigation had changed. We weren't looking for proof that my family owned the road anymore. The county records had already answered that. Now we were trying to understand how an entire HOA had convinced itself of something completely different. Sarah called the next afternoon. You busy? She asked. I think we found something. She didn't sound excited. She never did. But after working with her long enough, I'd learned to listen for what she didn't say. She hadn't said she'd found the answer. Just something. That was enough to get me in my truck. When I walked into her conference room, every document we'd collected was spread neatly across the table. The original deed, the certified survey, county parcel maps, tax records, recorded subdivision plats. Sarah wasn't looking at any of them. She was studying a timeline she'd sketched on a yellow legal pad. Let's go through it one more time, she said. When did the survey flags first show up? About 8 months ago. She wrote it down. Construction ribbon? A week or two later. HOA notices? Not long after that. She nodded without saying anything else. Then she slid one of the recorded subdivision plats toward me. Look at the southern boundary. I leaned over the table. Streets. Lots. Utility easements. Drainage areas. Everything looked exactly the way I'd expect. I'm not seeing it. Neither am I, Sarah replied. She tapped the edge of the drawing with her pen. That's the point. I looked again. Then it hit me. My ranch road crossed the edge of the subdivision, but it wasn't labeled as HOA property. It wasn't labeled as county property either. It wasn't labeled at all. It simply appeared on the drawing without any ownership note beside it. Sarah pulled out a second recorded plat file during a later phase of development. Same result. More houses. More streets. More engineering notes. The road stayed exactly the same. That's odd, I said. Very. She reached for the county tax records next. Year after year they showed the same parcel. Same legal description. Same boundaries. Nothing had ever separated the road from Carter Ranch. Sarah leaned back in her chair. So here's what we know. She held up one finger. The county never recorded a transfer. Another finger. The deed never changed. A third. The surveys never changed. She folded her hands together. Whatever convinced the HOA, it wasn't the public record. That was the first discovery that changed the direction of the investigation. Up until then, I'd assumed we simply hadn't found the right document. Instead, every official record pointed the same way. Carter Ranch had never lost ownership of the road. Sarah reached toward a thin folder sitting by itself near the end of the table. Unlike everything else we'd reviewed, it hadn't come from the county recorder's office. It had been sent over from county planning after we requested archived development files. She rested her hand on it, but didn't open it. This wasn't recorded with the deed, she said quietly. But somebody thought it was important. I looked at the folder. What's inside? She smiled just a little. I haven't read it yet. She slipped it into her briefcase and stood up. I'd rather look at it with someone who wrote the language. Who would that be? Daniel Brooks. She picked up her truck keys. If anyone can tell us why an entire HOA became so confident. She looked down at the unopened folder one last time. My guess is it starts here. It just doesn't end here. Whatever was inside that planning file, Rebecca Holloway acted like she'd already seen enough. She stopped asking questions. She stopped waiting for answers. She started making decisions. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox with the Redstone Ridge HOA logo stamped across the front. I carried it into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened it at the table. Across the top of the first page, in bold letters, were the words Notice of Immediate Compliance. According to the HOA, I was using association property without authorization. Effective immediately, I was ordered to stop driving on what they called HOA Access Road A until further notice. I read the letter once. Then I read it again. The strange part was what it didn't say. It mentioned HOA authority half a dozen times. It threatened fines, attorney's fees, additional enforcement if I refused to comply. But nowhere did it list a recorded deed. No county recording number. No parcel reference. No recorded easement. Plenty of conclusions. Not much evidence. I scanned the letter and sent it to Sarah. She called less than 10 minutes later. "One question," she said. "Does it cite a recording book and page?" I looked again. No. That's what I expected. Why? "Because if they're claiming ownership through recorded property rights," she said, "they should be able to tell us exactly where those rights were recorded." She drafted a short response asking the HOA to provide the recorded legal authority supporting every claim in the notice. Days passed. No answer. Instead, another certified letter arrived. This one sounded tougher. Daily fines. Collection costs. Possible legal action. The language got stronger. The supporting evidence stayed exactly the same. Then Rebecca stopped writing letters and started filing complaints. She reported that my ranch trucks were damaging HOA property. A county inspector came out, walked the entire entrance, checked maintenance records, took a few photographs, and left without issuing a single violation. A few days later, she filed another complaint, claiming I was blocking emergency access into the subdivision. The sheriff's office reviewed dispatch logs. No delayed emergency vehicles. No blocked responders. No incident reports connected to my ranch. That complaint disappeared just as quickly as the first one. Sarah never changed her advice. Keep every letter. Save every envelope. Stay calm. Looking back, staying calm was probably the hardest part. Knowing you're right doesn't make waiting any easier. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I turned off the county road just after sunrise and hit the brakes hard enough to splash coffee onto the dashboard. Overnight, someone had installed a heavy steel gate across my ranch road. Fresh concrete still surrounded the posts. A thick chain stretched across the entrance, and a bright reflective sign read, "Private HOA access. Authorized personnel only." 2 private security guards stood beside the gate. They looked uncomfortable. One quietly admitted they'd been hired the night before and instructed not to let anyone through without HOA approval. A few minutes later, Rebecca's white SUV rolled up behind them. She stepped out smiling like she'd finally reached the finish line. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "Until ownership is officially confirmed, this entrance will remain closed." I looked at the chain, then the fresh concrete, then the security guards shifting uneasily beside the gate. I reached into my pocket and called Sarah. She answered before the second ring. I barely finished explaining what I was seeing before she stopped me. "Ben," she said, "don't touch that gate." She paused just long enough to make sure I was listening. "Leave everything exactly the way it is." "I'm on my way." Sarah pulled into the ranch less than 40 minutes later. She parked on the shoulder, stepped out of her SUV, and looked at the gate without saying a word. She didn't walk toward Rebecca. She didn't ask anyone a single question. Instead, she slowly circled the entrance with her phone, taking photographs of the chain, the warning sign, the fresh concrete around the steel posts, and the tire tracks leading away from the auger. Click, click, click. That was all anyone heard. Rebecca folded her arms. "Taking pictures won't change anything," she said with an easy smile. Sarah took one last photo before slipping her phone into her pocket. "No," she replied, "but they'll help people remember exactly what today looked like." Rebecca laughed softly. "You're wasting your time. This road belongs to the HOA." Sarah looked at her for a moment. "Then showing me the recorded document shouldn't be difficult. Our attorney has everything." "Good." Sarah nodded once. "I'd like to see the recorded document." Rebecca's smile stayed in place, but she didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the leather portfolio sitting on the passenger seat of her SUV before coming back to Sarah. "The paperwork's being handled." Sarah wrote one short line on her legal pad. "All right." She didn't ask another question. That caught my attention. Usually, when Sarah stopped asking questions, it meant she'd already learned something important. Later that afternoon, we drove to the county survey department to meet Daniel Brooks. He already had the original deed spread across a drafting table beside the certified survey and every recorded subdivision plat. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of paper sliding across the table. Daniel compared one page after another without saying much. Every so often he'd make a note, then move to the next document. Nobody interrupted him. Finally, he reached for a thin folder that had arrived from county planning earlier that morning. Unlike everything else on the table, it wasn't part of the recorded property records. Daniel opened it carefully, and studied the first page. Then the second. Then another. He stopped for a little longer on one drawing before slowly closing the folder again. Sarah noticed. "So did I find something?" I asked. Daniel rested his hand on the closed folder. "Maybe. Good maybe." He smiled. "Accurate maybe." That was about as much as Daniel ever gave anyone before he finished checking the facts. He stood up and tucked the folder under his arm. "I'd like to compare this with one more county archive before I reach a conclusion." Sarah nodded. "Take your time." As we walked toward the parking lot, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me all afternoon. "Do you think Rebecca knows she's wrong?" Sarah thought about it before answering. "I think she believes she's right." "There's a difference?" Sarah opened her SUV door. A very big one. She looked back toward the survey office where Daniel had disappeared with the planning file. "One is a mistake." She paused. "The other depends on what happens after you learn the truth." Then she climbed into her SUV and drove away. I stood there for another minute watching the courthouse doors. Daniel still hadn't come back out. Whatever he was looking for, it wasn't in my family's records anymore. It was somewhere inside the county archives. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I had the feeling we were only one piece away from understanding why the HOA had become so certain they owned a road that had never left my family's land. Sarah called just before sunrise. "The county's finished," she said. Her voice sounded exactly the way it always did. Calm, measured, almost ordinary. "Meet us at your ranch entrance at 8. "Should I move the gate?" I asked. "No," she answered before I'd even finished the question. "Leave everything exactly the way it is." Then she hung up. I knew Sarah well enough not to ask why. If she wanted the gate untouched, there was a reason. By the time I reached the entrance, the morning fog was just beginning to lift off the pasture. The steel gate still blocked the road. The chain was still locked. The warning sign still reflected the first light of the day. Even the fresh tire tracks from the equipment that installed it remained clear in the gravel. Nothing had changed. That, apparently, was exactly what Sarah wanted. I parked beside the fence line, climbed out of my pickup, and poured the last sip of cold coffee onto the grass. Funny thing was, I wasn't anxious anymore. I'd spent weeks wondering what the records would say. The county already had its answer. I just didn't know it yet. Rebecca arrived a few minutes later with 3 HOA board members behind her. She stepped out smiling, looked at the gate, and gave a satisfied nod. "Good," she said. "It's still here." One of the board members glanced toward the road. "The sheriff confirmed?" Rebecca nodded confidently. "Everything's ready." She looked toward the contractors waiting beside their equipment. "We'll probably have this finished before lunch." Nobody from the construction crew looked nearly as confident. They stayed beside their trucks, talking quietly among themselves instead of unloading equipment. A few minutes later, Sarah pulled in. She was carrying the same black binder she'd been building since the first survey flag showed up months earlier. She walked straight to the gate, looked at the chain for several seconds, then closed the binder again. "Good," she said quietly. "Nothing's been disturbed." Daniel Brooks arrived shortly after that in a county pickup. This time he wasn't carrying survey maps or cardboard tubes. Just a thin county folder tucked under one arm. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Mr. Brooks," she called. "I hope you've finally sorted all this out." Daniel smiled politely. "The county has completed its review." Rebecca looked pleased. "Then today should clear everything up." "I believe it will," he replied. He didn't say another word. By then, homeowners had started gathering along the shoulder again. Some carried travel mugs. Others had their phones ready, expecting another confrontation. Quiet conversations drifted through the crowd before fading away one by one. At exactly 8 o'clock, the sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly onto the shoulder, followed by the same 2 deputies who had been there from the beginning. Nobody hurried. Nobody looked surprised. The sheriff stepped out holding a single county folder. He nodded once to Sarah, then to Daniel. After that, he walked straight to the gate. One deputy stopped beside the chain. The other opened his notebook but didn't write anything yet. Looking back, that's the moment everything changed. The investigation was over. Nobody was there to ask another question. They were there to explain an answer that had already been sitting in the county records all along. The sheriff waited until the last conversation faded before opening the county folder. He didn't call everyone together. He didn't have to. People drifted closer on their own. Homeowners stepped away from their trucks. The contractor walked over with his hard hat tucked under one arm. Even the 2 security guards quietly moved closer to listen. Rebecca smiled as she approached the sheriff. "Looks like we're finally settling this," she said. "Yes, ma'am," the sheriff replied. "We are." She glanced toward the contractors. "Once we're done here, they'll finish the entrance." The sheriff didn't respond. He looked at the steel gate for several seconds before turning back to the crowd. "The county has completed its review," he said calmly. "Every recorded document connected to this roadway has been examined." Nobody interrupted him. Daniel Brooks stepped forward carrying two clear document sleeves. He placed them on the hood of the sheriff's cruiser. The first contained the original 1953 survey. The second held the certified deed to Carter Ranch. Sarah quietly added a third document, a certified report from the county survey department. Then she stepped back without saying another word. The sheriff rested one hand on the paperwork. The county reviewed the original deed, certified field notes, recorded surveys, subdivision plats, parcel history, tax records, boundary monuments, and archived planning files. He paused. Every recorded record reaches the same conclusion. Rebecca folded her arms. "Our attorney already reviewed those documents." "Your attorney reviewed documents provided to them," the sheriff answered. "The county reviewed the recorded chain of title." Daniel carefully opened the original survey. He pointed to the gravel road running across the faded drawing. "This roadway has remained inside Carter Ranch since it was first surveyed in 1953. He tapped a handwritten notation beside it. "Private agricultural access, Carter Ranch." Then he looked up. "There has never been a recorded deed transferring ownership of this roadway." He turned one page in the county report. "There has never been a recorded dedication." Another page. "There has never been a recorded easement granting the HOA authority to manage or restrict access." Rebecca immediately reached into her portfolio and removed the planning drawing she'd relied on from the beginning. "Then explain this." Daniel accepted the drawing and laid it beside the deed. "This is an internal planning exhibit prepared during subdivision construction." He pointed to a shaded corridor leading toward the ranch entrance. It identified temporary construction access for heavy equipment while the subdivision was being built. He looked around at the homeowners standing behind Rebecca. It was never recorded with the deed. It never became part of the chain of title. It never transferred ownership. Complete silence settled over the entrance. Daniel folded the drawing closed. At some point, someone treated a temporary construction document as though it permanently changed property ownership. He gently shook his head. The county found no record that ever happened. Sarah quietly closed the black binder she'd been carrying since the investigation began. She didn't need to add anything. The records had already done the talking. The sheriff closed the county folder. "Based on the county's findings, Mr. Carter has remained the lawful owner of this roadway at all times." He turned toward the steel gate blocking the entrance. "Which means this barrier wasn't installed on HOA property." Then he looked directly at Rebecca. "It was installed on Mr. Carter's private property without legal authority." Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the breeze moving through the live oaks behind the ranch. Then, without saying a word, the contractor slowly removed his hard hat and looked toward his crew. The contractor didn't wait for anyone to tell him what to do. He looked at the sheriff, then at Daniel Brooks, and finally at the steel gate his crew had installed only 2 days earlier. He slowly slipped off his hard hat and let out a quiet breath. "Pack it up," he said. Nobody argued. One by one, the workers climbed into their machines. Diesel engines rumbled back to life, not to continue the job, but to leave it behind. The excavator eased into reverse. Flatbed trucks pulled onto the county road. A forklift loaded and used fencing panels back onto a trailer. Within minutes, every piece of equipment that had arrived to secure HOA property was heading in the opposite direction. Rebecca watched without saying a word. "Sheriff," she finally said, "they can't just leave." The sheriff looked at her calmly. "They can if they're standing on someone else's property." Another long silence settled over the entrance. One of the deputies walked to the chain stretched across the road and finished taking the last few photographs. His partner measured the steel posts one final time before closing his notebook. Click. Measure. Close. Their work was done. Behind Rebecca, the homeowners had stopped whispering. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. An older gentleman stepped forward first. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "did the board ever see the actual deed?" She didn't answer. A woman standing beside him asked another question. Did we ever verify any of this with the county? Rebecca looked from one face to another. Our attorney reviewed the documents. That's not what she asked, another homeowner replied. Did anyone on the board verify the county records? Nobody spoke after that. The answer was obvious. One of the HOA board members slowly removed his name badge and slipped it into his pocket. Another quietly shook his head before walking back toward his SUV. A third never looked at Rebecca again. Sarah stood beside me with her binder closed under one arm. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply watched the scene unfold. Daniel Brooks carefully placed the original survey and certified deed back into their protective sleeves. The records had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had answered the question without raising their voices. The sheriff accepted the deputy's completed report, signed the final page, and handed a copy to Sarah. Then he nodded toward the gate. Go ahead. One deputy unlocked the heavy padlock. The other pushed the steel gate open. It swung aside so easily it was almost hard to believe it had caused weeks of arguments. Sunlight spilled farther down the gravel road than it had the day before. The entrance looked the way it always should have. Open, quiet, honest. A woman who had been recording the entire morning slowly lowered her phone. I thought we were doing the right thing, she said softly. Nobody answered her. They didn't need to. The contractor climbed into his pickup, looked once more toward the open road, and tipped his cap to me before driving away. One by one, the homeowners followed. No applause, no shouting, just people leaving with a very different understanding than the one they'd arrived with. Rebecca remained standing beside the empty gate. The crowd that had gathered behind her that morning was gone. So was the certainty she'd carried for months. The sheriff adjusted his hat and looked at me. Mr. Carter, he said, I believe this concludes our involvement. Thank you, Sheriff. He nodded once. Take care of your ranch. Always have, I replied. He smiled just a little before turning back to his cruiser. I watched the last patrol car disappear down the county road. The breeze moved through the live oaks, and somewhere beyond the pasture, a meadowlark started singing again. The road hadn't changed. It never had. The only thing that changed that morning was who finally understood where it had always belonged. By the following Saturday, it was hard to believe the gate had ever been there. The steel posts were gone. The chain was gone. Even the fresh concrete had been hauled away. All that remained was the same gravel road my grandfather built one truckload of limestone at a time more than 70 years earlier. I eased my pickup onto the road just before sunrise and rolled the windows down. The familiar crunch of limestone under the tires sounded exactly the way it always had. Funny how one ordinary sound can tell you everything is finally back where it belongs. I slowed beside the old survey marker and climbed out. It still stood there beside the fence line, weathered by decades of Texas summers and winter storms. I brushed a little dust from the top with my hand, just like my father always did. Back then I thought it was a habit. Now I knew it was respect. A few days after the county closed its investigation, every homeowner in Redstone Ridge received a letter from the HOA board. It acknowledged the county's findings, confirmed that the ranch road had never been HOA property, and announced that all future decisions involving neighboring land would require verification through county records before any board action could be taken. It wasn't a long letter. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was probably the first truly accurate document the HOA had sent during the entire dispute. Rebecca Holloway resigned quietly the following week. There wasn't a public meeting. There wasn't a speech. Someone else simply took over the agenda at the next board meeting. I never went. It wasn't my community to run. It never had been. Over the next month, a few homeowners stopped by the ranch. They didn't come to argue. They came to apologize. One older couple brought a homemade peach pie because, as the husband awkwardly admitted, my wife said showing up empty-handed didn't seem right. We stood beside the cattle guard talking for nearly half an hour. Before they left, he looked down the road and quietly said, "Guess we should have trusted the county records instead of the rumors." "Most people do," I answered. Eventually, Sarah dropped off one last binder a few weeks later. Inside were certified copies of the deed, the survey, the county findings, and every document we'd collected along the way. "Keep it with your family papers," she said. "The next generation shouldn't have to start from scratch." I slid the binder into the same fireproof cabinet where my grandfather had kept the original deed for decades. Somehow it felt like it had finally found the right shelf. Spring settled over the ranch not long after that. Emily's bluebonnets bloomed beside the entrance again, stretching along both sides of the road just as they had every year before. The cattle still wandered toward the north pasture each morning. Meadowlarks still perched on the fence posts. The wind still moved through the live oaks before the heat of the day arrived. Life hadn't really changed. It had simply returned to normal. Sometimes people ask whether I still think about the HOA or everything that happened. Honestly, not very often. Ranches have a way of keeping you busy. Fences still need mending. Cattle still need feeding. The seasons don't slow down because somebody lost an argument. Every now and then, though, I'll drive past that old survey marker just after sunrise and think about my grandfather climbing into that worn-out dump truck for another load of limestone. He never imagined a sheriff would someday stand on that road explaining who owned it. He never built it to win a legal fight. He built it because his family needed a way home. Every morning since then, my tires still crunch across that same stretch of gravel before the sun clears the trees. The bluebonnets are still there. The old survey marker is still there. And so is the road. It never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the people who cared for it long before anyone thought to question where it had always been.